Hello everyone. I still haven't got my office and stuff set back up since the move, so bear with me on these videos. My files I think are still in storage and it's still kinda crazy. But for this series on war crimes, I have went around and around in my own mind about different things to cover. And while I will be covering things like genocide and sexual slavery, torture, and a few other more graphic things, I'm also going to be covering things that is associated with war in general. Because if it wasn't for wars, we wouldn't have war crimes. So in order to make this series complete, I have to cover a few different things as well. I hope that makes sense. So for this one, I'm going to talk a little bit about veterans, refugees, and victims of war crimes that are all vulnerable to PTSD. And PTSD comes with many different things, but it's highly associated to wars. And mental health is often used in political discourse and arguments. Post-traumatic stress disorder was the subject January 8th when Representative Ilhan Omar herself, a Somalian refugee who had spent years in a refugee camp in Kenya, said, "Every time I hear conversations around war, I find myself being stricken with PTSD." Representative Jim Banks, a veteran of the war in Afghanistan, found these comments offensive to our nation's veterans who really do have PTSD. So either way you look at it, there's going to be one side or the other side. But PTSD is a real thing. PTSD is a consequence of exposure to extreme traumatic experiences such as natural disasters, motor vehicle accidents, assault, robbery, rape, combat, and torture. Trauma can happen to or be witnessed by the person. For instance, a refugee child might be exposed to views of mutilated bodies or torture or murder of loved ones. Chronic exposure to others' trauma is a common cause of PTSD among law enforcement personnel and first responders as well. A number of people developed PTSD after exposure to trauma. Much research is focused on genetic and biological and environmental factors that lead to development of PTSD in one person and not in another. Researchers know, for example, that childhood exposure to trauma increases the odds of PTSD after an adult has experienced trauma. PTSD includes a variety of symptoms that reflect the victim's brain remaining in survival mode to protect him or her from reoccurrence of trauma. People with PTSD are highly anxious, always on edge, screening for danger, and easily startled. They can also have frequent nightmares, disturbed sleep, flashbacks, or sensory experiences as though the trauma is happening here and now, and intrusive traumatic memories. Other symptoms include irritability, emotional numbness, social withdrawal, and avoidance of any reminder of the trauma. Trauma is very common, and so is PTSD. Nearly 8% of the U.S. population fulfills diagnostic criteria for PTSD at some point in their lives. In special populations with high levels of trauma exposure, such as combat-exposed veterans and first responders, PTSD may be as prevalent as 30%. Trauma exposure runs up to 90% among urban people living in poverty, and about 20% of this population may meet criteria for PTSD. While these statistics are already alarming, those affected by trauma constitute a larger group than the above numbers. That is because in research, to diagnose a person with PTSD, they have to fulfill all diagnostic criteria. For instance, if a person has flashbacks and nightmares and intrusive memories, but not some of the other symptoms, they are not considered to having PTSD in studies. PTSD is very prevalent, ranging between 20% and 80% among refugees and civilian victims of torture. This is understandable in the context of what they have endured. A refugee is often exposed to terror, torture, and physical or emotional injury to self or others, loss of loved ones and belongings, and scarcity and resources for months to years. Those who get to leave the war zone typically end up in a crowded refugee camp with low access to resources and years of uncertainty about their future. Living in a new environment post-settlement is also not very easy, given common scarcity of resources and the need to start over. Civilians are also not trained or prepared for war and do not have a sense of control or ability to fight in such situations. For all the above reasons, it is not difficult to comprehend the very high prevalence of PTSD among this population. In a study among Syrian refugees in the U.S., research teams have found that 1 in 3 adults meet the diagnostic threshold for PTSD, and almost half had high anxiety and depression. Anxiety was very high among refugee children, and 80% showed symptoms of separation anxiety. PTSD can be worsened by stress and exposure to reminders of trauma. This is one reason why traumatized people tend to avoid reminders of their traumatic experience. For instance, a rape victim may avoid any person nearly resembling the rapist. Combat veterans with PTSD are often bothered by 4th of July fireworks, which resemble explosions and combat noise. They may also feel nervous at the sight of a roadkill, which can remind them of improvised explosive devices. It's often heard that veterans with PTSD avoid watching Saving Private Ryan, a war movie that realistically portrays combat scenes and killings. Trauma reminders can lead to recurrence of intrusive memories, flashbacks, and resurgence of nightmares. A victim of rape, when exposed to a scent reminding them of the perpetrator, may experience somatic flashback experiencing the touching of the predator. There are effective treatments for PTSD, and new treatments keep emerging. Psychotherapy allows patients to detach extreme negative emotions from trauma memories and become functional again, without needing to avoid the safe situations. Medications, which mostly include antidepressants, reduce the high level of emotional arousal, allowing a person more effectively use their rational brain in dealing with stressful conditions. Lifestyle changes are as important in addressing anxiety. Fighting stigma is another important step. Those with a large microphones, such as public officials and politicians, have to be more aware of how their words may affect victims of trauma and violence. Now, I personally feel like mental health professionals should stay out of politics and that political figures should stay out of mental health. I feel that about a lot of different things. You know, this person has no business messing with the affairs of this other, you know, person or organization or whatever. And I know a few soldiers. I have family members that are soldiers. And I also know people that have came from war areas. And PTSD is one of the major things that affect their everyday lives. So when I started this series for war crimes, I decided to go ahead and include different effects of war. You know, we open up the news on our phones or whatever, and that's what we see. We see war. We see fights. We see people fighting for rights and people fighting to take people's rights. Combat is everywhere, and not just in combat zones. So I'm working on a video about genocide, and there is so much information to include in that, so it may actually take me, you know, another week or so before I can actually drop that video. But I will be putting out some other little videos, kind of short, you know, 10-15 minute videos about different things that affect people, civilians mostly, in war zones, while I am doing the videos about the war crimes in general. And I even have some information on the effects. Okay, let me just... Well, of course, somebody's going live when I'm recording this video. Okay. Anyway, the effects that Richard Allen with the Delphi case, the way he was being treated in prison before being convicted. His lawyer said in an affidavit that it was similar to a war hostage. My words, you know, I'm summing it up. And that got me to thinking. So, by me thinking, I started diving into different prisons. Okay, let me backtrack just a little bit. My grandson needed my help to find a very important toy. So, with what Richard Allen's lawyer had said about him being treated like a war criminal, that got me to thinking about different prisons. And I have helped Lorenzo Gilliard be moved to a different prison because the conditions and the treatment within that one prison, and I'm not going to call them out or anything because they did take care of the issue once I approached them about it, so I'm not going to call them out on it. Had they not taken care of it, I would be blasting that shit everywhere. But he did end up getting moved to a better facility after I had contacted them and told them that the public would be made aware of the treatment of the mostly specific African American men in that facility. They were not receiving ice buckets. They had no cooling whatsoever, and they were crowding them up. It was horrible. Like, there is a long ass list of shit that they were doing in that particular prison, and the living conditions was horrific. So I helped him get moved to another facility, as well as many others. But I was helping him specifically, which resulted in helping many. And then I see this stuff about Richard Allen and health conditions and showers and just basically taking away his humanity before he was even convicted of said crimes. Now, I'm not here to say he's innocent, but I'm sure as hell not here to say that he's guilty until I see the end of his trial. But either way, being treated like war criminals is not something that just happens in a war zone. It is not something that happens in countries that... Okay, so companies that basically America thinks less of. I personally see everybody as equals. But the American government and stuff has certain countries on a list that they deem as unimportant, which sucks, but it is how it is. And in those countries, you know, we hear the stuff from our political figures, and we expect war crimes and stuff like that to happen because they put it in our head that this is just how things work. But this is not how things work. This is not how things have to work. Every human deserves to be treated as human. And I personally don't care what crime they have committed. They need to be treated as human. Just like I don't agree with the crimes that they committed. And once they get the guilty verdict, then yes, they are guilty as fuck. And they do not need to have pizza parties and freedom and voting rights or, you know, anything and everything that we normally could do on a daily basis. No, they need to be locked away. They are guilty. But when you put a man in a prison cell that is basically no bigger than a freaking dog cage, that is criminal in itself. So I totally understand why his lawyer was stating that he was being treated like a war criminal. And that's going to be some stuff that I also cover in this series. I'm not going to have a specific video drop time because I'm still working in the town I come from. I'm living an hour away. Trying to get everything still unpacked and organized in the storage. And I've got 2 storages, so I'm trying to make sure that everything that we just need is here in this one and not in the other town. Plus the basic housework and mowing the yard and stuff. And I got handed a job. I went into the dollar store to buy my granddaughter some diapers, and a lady was on the phone, and she was like literally just cussing out somebody, saying it's not her fucking fault she doesn't speak Spanish. So me and my big mouth, I was like, hey, if it's an emergency, I can help you translate. And she's just like, "You're hired." And we proceeded to talk, and I was given a job here in this town. So, working an hour away a couple days a week and going through the whole paperwork and stuff to start this job here this weekend, my videos are not going to be coming out kind of like I hope, that they would. But I will get them up and I will get them out. I'll probably be dropping a lot of stuff on my community tab as well. Different kind of resources or different ways to report war crimes in different countries and stuff like that. And maybe like what each agency can do, how far they can take it if it is reported to them. So there's a lot that's going to come out on this in this series. And I'm not really one for trigger warnings. I do put them up on some videos on occasion, but the only ones that I'm planning on putting a trigger warning on is for the one about genocide and the one about sexual slavery. Those two will come with a trigger warning, but the rest of them, I'm going to try to keep them as, light as possible, even though it's a horrific thing. I want to make it to where people can actually get the information and not be turned off by the gore in it. But there is a few videos that I can't help it because it's going to be about the gore because that's part of it. But I will give a warning for those of you that can't tolerate stuff like that. So I'm going to close out this video and go get to mowing this yard because unfortunately it's not going to mow itself. But much love, everybody. Stay safe.